nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
So my name is Mittal Kulkarni. I'm one of the associate directors at Princeton, and this next session is our session of vision talks. We're going to have 3 talks across our 3 areas. 15-minute talks sort of talking about their vision for a particular aspect of cyber or cyber-physical or socio-technical resilience. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Prateek Mittal, our first vision speaker. So he's in the area of cyber, as we're defining it. And so he is interested in privacy-preserving and secure systems. He's going to tell us about a little bit of his work on networks and how they vary over time and how they can be attacked over time. But let me quickly introduce him. He's an associate professor at Princeton in their EE department. And if I were to read his whole bio, I would use up all of his time, but let me at least give the highlights, which are that he has won the Career Award and 2 different Young Investigator Awards from, I think, ARO and ONR. So he's incredibly accomplished, and I'm very much looking forward to your vision.
Thanks for the introduction, Milind, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Purdue today. I was just chatting with Milind and Saurabh earlier in the day. My first ever visit to Purdue, I think, was almost 10 years ago for the Midwest Security Symposium, and it's always a pleasure to come back here. In this talk, I will showcase how an adversary can exploit aspects of the system that can change over time, or temporal dynamics, to compromise system resilience. Now, let me begin by highlighting the conventional approach that a system or security analyst takes for reasoning about resilience, which is to come up with abstractions of the system that are simple. And the simplicity is the key to making analysis tractable. However, a key limitation in these abstractions is that they often do not account for the effect of time. They often consider a static model of the system. Moreover, these abstractions also limit the effects of other interdependent systems. Now, of course, in practice, our systems are anything but static. We have temporal dynamics. We have aspects of the system that change over time. This includes client-side dynamics, for example, the client location. This includes network-side dynamics, for example, aspects pertaining to internet routing that can change over time. This also includes aspects pertaining to server-side state as well as environmental state. For example, the number of clients that might be simultaneously connecting to a particular server. Now, of particular interest to us is the fact that an adversary may be able to exert control over these temporal dynamics. And this control may, in fact, come from other interdependent infrastructure. So the key question I want to ask today is, what is the impact of these temporal dynamics on cyber resilience? Now, if you go back to the opening remarks that Saurabh made, he talked about the definition of resilience, which included being adaptive to changing conditions in the system. So from that perspective, this is not a very surprising question to ask. I think the key thing I want to point out is that these dynamics are coming from an adversarial source, and possibly through interdependent infrastructure. So I will illustrate the compromise of cyber resilience through 2 case studies today. The first case study is that of compromising our public key infrastructure. This is going to be using the Border Gateway Protocol. So the BGP here is the source of temporal dynamics. The second case study, which I'll discuss later on in the talk, will be about disrupting our power grid infrastructure. And here I will use the threat vector of an Internet of Things botnet, which is really the source of temporal dynamics. So let me first jump into compromising our public key infrastructure. Public key infrastructure is useful for disseminating digital certificates. Now, digital certificates are the root of trust for all of our online communications. They provide an authentic binding between a domain name and its corresponding public key. So here's an example of a digital certificate belonging to google.com, and we can see that this digital certificate has been signed by a certificate authority known as Google Internet Authority G3. The certificate is used to bootstrap secure communications via protocols like TLS, or Transport Layer Security, and they provide the very foundation for all confidentiality and integrity on the internet today. So a question that we might ask is, how does one go about obtaining such a digital certificate? This is what the process looks like. So think of a domain, say example.com, and imagine that you are the owner of this domain. Now you can go to trusted authorities on the internet, known as certificate authorities, and request to be issued a digital certificate. So this is known as the certificate signing request. Now, before directly giving you a digital certificate, the certificate authority must, of course, validate that you are the true owner of this domain. So it issues you a particular challenge. This challenge could take the form, hey, why don't you go and make some custom modifications to the web server running on your domain? And if you manage to make those modifications, I will believe that you are indeed the legitimate owner of this domain. So upon completion of these server modifications, the certificate authority can now validate that those domains, the custom modifications were indeed made at this domain using, for example, an HTTP GET request to a custom URL. Finally, the certificate authority can validate that it got the right response. And once it's convinced that you're actually the owner of this domain, it can now issue you a digital certificate. So this is known as the domain validation protocol on the internet. So one of our key observations in our work at Princeton was that there is a critical weakness in the protocol that allows an adversary to obtain a digital certificate for a domain that it does not control. And this vulnerability comes from steps number 5 and 6, which correspond to this authority validating that you've actually made the right modifications to a domain name. And the observation here is that these messages are neither encrypted nor authenticated. This is extremely ironic. This protocol is the root of all cryptography on the internet, and yet this protocol does not use any encryption or any authentication. And this is fundamental because we cannot use encryption at this point. We cannot use any authentication protocol at this point because this domain does not have a digital certificate. Right? That's why it's engaging in this protocol. Thus, if an adversary manages to manipulate how routing happens on the internet, and this can be done via BGP hijack attacks, an adversary can intercept the HTTP GET request, and the adversary can spoof the right HTTP response. And this will allow an adversary to obtain a digital certificate for a domain that it does not control. In a paper that we published at Usenix Security in 2018, we demonstrated the feasibility of this attack via real-world BGP hijacks, and we did this in a way that was safe and ethical. So let me give you a very simple example for this. We set up our own victim web server. This was behind an autonomous system in Los Angeles. And initially, all traffic from certificate authorities worldwide was going through this autonomous system in Los Angeles to reach our victim server. Now, because of the insecurity in the BGP protocol, an adversary can announce a BGP prefix that covers the IP address of the victim server and make this announcement to hijack traffic. So we collaborated with real-world autonomous systems to help us propagate our BGP messages, and we did this using the peering framework set up by Columbia University. So I want to emphasize that this infrastructure is real-world, and the messages that we were injecting in this experiment were being propagated to the worldwide ecosystem of more than 50,000 plus BGP-speaking routers. And as soon as our announcement kicked in the BGP ecosystem, we were able to hijack traffic from all of the certificate authorities in the world towards the victim IP address, and then use it to compromise the domain validation protocol, as I illustrated in the previous slide. So we were able to demonstrate successful attacks against the top 5 certificate authorities in the world. This includes entities like Let's Encrypt, Komodo, as well as GlobalSign. So just to summarize the implications of this case study, the attack infrastructure that we've set up at Princeton allows us to obtain a digital certificate for an arbitrary domain on the internet. So this could be the domain of Purdue.edu. This could be the domain of the National Science Foundation. We could steal all your proposals that you're writing. Or think about, very sensitive government agencies, and we can set up digital certificates for these domains, and we can impersonate their identities. And we can do this with an arbitrary certificate authority on the internet. So this is not a vulnerability that's specific to a particular certificate authority. And really the temporal dynamic that we were exploiting here is the dynamic of the BGP protocol. So this happens to be an example of an interdependent infrastructure that was not explicitly modeled in the original domain validation protocol. If you're curious about countermeasures, we're currently working with Let's Encrypt, which is the world's largest certificate authority, to secure system design against BGP-based attacks. Next, I will switch to the second case study in this talk, which is to disrupt the power grid infrastructure. And we will be doing this using a botnet of Internet of Things devices. All right, so a very common assumption in reliable operations of power grids is to be able to predict the demand of power on an hourly and daily basis, and this is often done using historical data as well as predictions of future weather conditions. But the question that we are interested in asking is that with the growth of high wattage IoT devices, such as air conditioners and water heaters, is this still a safe assumption? So one aspect I want to highlight here is that there's been tremendous efforts in terms of thinking about resilience and security that is focused on the control plane of the power grid infrastructure. So think about using software vulnerabilities to directly hack into the control plane of the power grid and then manipulate that infrastructure. In contrast, the attack vector that we are looking at comes from the consumers of this electricity. So I want you to imagine a botnet of high wattage IoT devices. So think about an adversary that controls hundreds of thousands of water heaters or air conditioners. So here's a very simple table that lists out the power usage of some of the common high wattage IoT devices. And we can see that we have air conditioners that consume around a kilowatt of power. And we also have water heaters that consume around 5 kilowatts of power. Now, if we try to multiply this number with the size of previous IoT botnets that we have seen, for example, the Mirai botnet, which had around 600,000 devices, we can see that an adversary that controls a Mirai-sized botnet of water heaters now has the ability to control almost 3 gigawatts of power. And this is equivalent to having access to some of the largest currently deployed nuclear power plants. What can an adversary with this capability do? So a very simple attack that an adversary can do with an IoT botnet is to manipulate the demand in a very quick manner in the power grid to disrupt its operations. So the attack is actually very simple. The adversary compromises these devices because all of these devices are networked, and in a synchronous manner, just switches them on or switches them off. And this instantaneous increase in demand at a very, very large scale can then result in tripping of generators and failure of lines in the power grid. So here's some results that showcase the potential consequences of this MadIoT type attack. An imbalance in demand and supply is induced by these MadIoT attacks. And this imbalance results in a sudden drop in the frequency of the system. And this drop, the magnitude of this drop depends upon the overall inertia that the power system has. Now, if this drop goes below a particular threshold, so in this case, for example, around 58.5 hertz, the system will result in the tripping of the generator, leading to a power blackout. For example, in our simulations on the Western System Coordinated Council bus, this is the WSCC 9 bus system, we found that roughly a 30% increase in power demand leads to the tripping of all system generators, leading to a blackout. So just to give you a sense of the number of compromised devices in this scenario, to increase the demand by 30% here, the adversary will need to control a botnet of roughly 90,000 air conditioners or roughly 18,000 water heaters. An imbalance in demand and supply can also result in line failures. And if these line failures occur in some strategic places in the power grid topology, a single line failure can lead to a cascading series of line failures. So work on the Polish power grid topology from 2008 shows that just a 1% increase in demand in the Polish grid in 2008 could result to a series of cascading failures impacting roughly 263 lines and resulting in an outage of 86% of the system. So overall, this talk sheds light into how temporal dynamics in interdependent systems can be used to compromise resilience. So I discussed two examples. The first used BGP, which is really a source of network-level temporal dynamics to compromise the security of the public key infrastructure. And the second uses an IoT botnet, which is an example of an end-host dynamic effect to disrupt the power grid infrastructure. So for our community that's thinking about resilience, I think the big opportunity here lies in terms of understanding the dynamics and the interdependence across system operations. So some of the key questions I want to motivate are, to what extent could an adversary influence the temporal dynamics in systems that we care about? What is the effect of this temporal dynamics, and this is an adversarial temporal dynamics, on the security and the resilience of the system? And finally, to secure our critical infrastructure, how can we design defense mechanisms that are aware of these temporal dynamics? So with that, I conclude this talk. Thank you for your attention. And I would just like to thank my key collaborators in both of these two case studies, students Henry, Saleh, Yukshin, and Ani, and my colleagues at Princeton, Jennifer Wexford, and Winsport. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions. If you have more questions, we'll have opportunities at the breakout session to sort of deep dive into some of these topics. Yeah.
Regarding the BGP hacking, you first said that the lack of bootstrap was a problem because you couldn't encrypt the communication with them, so you used something else.
Right.
And then you said that that was used to go and forge a certificate for Purdue, let's say.
Right.
Purdue already has certificates, so would they not already be using anything for ones that already have established a bootstrap?
Right. It turns out that when Purdue's certificate expires and they go out to set up a new certificate, the previous certificate is not used because it could potentially have been compromised or lost. So the current standards do not actually bootstrap a new digital certificate from a previous certificate. And the key challenge, if you actually change the proposal to do what you're suggesting, the key challenge will be that of usability. Because what if, some disgruntled administrator in the networking team at Purdue gets access to a certificate and you want to actually revoke it and get a fresh one? You don't want to rely on the previous certificate for that. Go ahead.
I wonder if for the IoT case, the attack is temporarily giving that perception that there is a high demand.
Right.
But there are other sensors in the network. For example, is that day excessively hot so that all of a sudden everybody is turning on their air conditioning? So if you rely on a single type of sensor, that can be hacked. But it is not possible, as you said, that there is an interdependent system. So these are networks of networks. And when you take sensing data from a variety of systems, and then wouldn't that be more resilient in some way?
Yeah, that's a great observation. So could potential sensor data be used to detect these attacks and then respond to them? So just to clarify, in this work, we're not hacking into other sensor systems. We're hacking directly into devices like air conditioners and devices like power heaters and synchronously manipulating the demand. So one key challenge that power grid operators would face is that an adversary can very easily synchronize all of these devices. So this demand surge is near instantaneous. So any control system that you have in place that might take data from uncompromised benign sensors would face the challenge of responding very, very quickly. And by the time it responds, perhaps the frequency of the generator is already below a critical value, or some lines have already failed, leading to other cascading effects. But indeed, I think your broader point is very well taken. We really need systems that can, if not fully prevent the types of attacks I showed, at least detect and recover from these attacks.
So actually, I have a question that maybe it will be best answered in like a breakout session or a panel later. There's sort of this classic thing in these security settings where you come up with an attack and then you sort of come up with a defense that patches the attack, and you come up with the next attack and come up with the next defense. Is there some design principle that we should be going for that lets us figure out kind of ab initio that, hey, there are going to be these problems in things like BGP or the way that we handle demand surges and things like that?
Yeah, this is a very, very important and a very, very tough question. So I think a high-level principle that comes to mind is let's start making our abstractions more reflective of the real world. Like, let's start introducing the effect of time in system operations. Let's start modeling to some degree the effect of interdependent infrastructure, and then perhaps we have some hope of proactively building some solutions.
All right, let's thank Prateek again.